Once again, I'm pleased to welcome you to Dialogue on Public Issues. I'm John Chowning with Campbellsville University. In today's segment, we continue with our series of interviews with candidates in the Kentucky November 5th general election. I'm very pleased to be interviewing our Republican nominee for Kentucky Attorney General, Daniel Cameron. Daniel, welcome back.
Dr. Chowning, thank you so much.
Appreciate you taking time from what I know is a very busy schedule.
Yes, sir.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. You were here during the primary and voters are getting to know you, but again, I think it's good for folks to hear about your background.
Of course. Well, I grew up in Elizabethtown, Hardin County, Kentucky. My parents owned a small business there. They owned a coffee shop for about 16 years. And of course, I had an opportunity to work there in the summers. I tell them they were a little bit ahead of the Starbucks craze, but it was a really good experience for me to work there. If I wasn't there, I was either on the ball fields or in church, and so graduated from John Hardin High School, then went to the University of Louisville for undergrad. I played a little bit of football there. Play is a very generous term. I spent a lot of time on the bench, but it was a good experience. We won the Liberty Bowl, went to the Gator Bowl, and won the Orange Bowl, which at that time was the pinnacle of the program. I then stayed at U of L for law school, was the president of the Student Bar Association my third year, and also was a member of the Brandeis Law Review. After that, I went and clerked for a federal judge, a gentleman by the name of Greg Van Tatenhove over in the Eastern District of Kentucky, a prestigious law clerkship that I was honored to get. Then worked for Stites and Harbison, a law firm in Louisville, for about 2 years, and then I got a call from Senator McConnell, asked me to go to D.C. to be his general counsel, and so I prayed about it and ultimately made the decision into February, beginning of March of 2015 to go up and be his counsel, and it was a transformative experience for me. I worked closely with President Trump and Senator McConnell getting Neil Gorsuch confirmed to the Supreme Court. But what I was most proud of, and probably the reason I'm sitting in this chair today, is that I had an opportunity to help work closely with our Kentucky law enforcement community on really confronting what I believe is a public safety challenge of our lifetime, and that is the drug epidemic. So I worked with the law enforcement community here to bring in some additional dollars through the Office of National Drug Control Policy to help with our drug interdiction efforts here in the Commonwealth. And so I came back in June of 2017 and wanted to continue to figure out a way to be a meaningful contributor around that conversation around the drug epidemic. And for my judgment, the Attorney General's office really should be the tip of the spear in terms of confronting this challenge. This office really needs to reclaim its role as the chief law enforcement office here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And so I got in the race for Attorney General on January 22nd with a very, in my judgment, a two-pronged message, which is to return the office to its role as the chief law enforcement office, advocating for our Commonwealth and county attorneys and our law enforcement community more globally. But in addition to that, getting back to the bread and butter basics of defending the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. So those are the two salient messages that I've tried to campaign on across all 120 counties, and I've been really fortunate in the reception that we've received, and just been thankful and grateful really for the opportunity to be the Republican nominee and to really take this message into the November 5th election.
Why did you choose to become a candidate in 2019?
I chose to become a candidate in 2019 because of the strength of the relationships that I have with the law enforcement community, and I thought I could help bring some credibility back to the Office of the Attorney General in really reclaiming its responsibility as the chief law enforcement office. I think you don't have to look any further than the fact that just a couple weeks ago, the Fraternal Order of Police, which is our largest law enforcement community organization here in Kentucky, endorsed this campaign for Attorney General because they understand the relationships that I have with the law enforcement community, that I believe that the Attorney General's office and the role of Attorney General is a job worth having. It's not just a stepping stone to a different office. This is an important office, and the issues that come across the Attorney General's office are large in magnitude. I think the law enforcement community wants continuity and stability in the AG's office. They want somebody that's going to advocate and work very closely with them, be a good neighbor and a good partner to our state and federal law enforcement community. And so that's what I bring to the table in terms of those relationships and the ability to lead that office of Attorney General effectively into the next decade.
How would you articulate the duties of the office, the basic requirements expected and required of an Attorney General?
Well, I think the main priority of the Attorney General is to be the chief law enforcement office here in Kentucky, but the other responsibility that I think you have when you take the oath, when you raise your hand to be the Attorney General, is to defend and enforce the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. I often tell people on the campaign trail that you send your elected representatives to Frankfort, here, Bam Carney, Max Wise, others, to Frankfort to really make the policy judgments and the policy decisions You don't send your Attorney General there to then substitute his preferences or the judgments of his liberal Democratic base for those of the will of the people. So again, we're going to get back to the bread and butter basics and responsibility of the Attorney General's office as being the first person or individual that enforces and defends those laws of the General Assembly.
Mm-hmm. There's one matter that has been just occurred a week or two before we are doing this interview, and that is a lawsuit that has been filed alleging that you don't meet the constitutional requirements for the office in terms of the number of years you will have practiced law. Comment on that and how you feel about that,
Yes, sir.
and how you respond to that challenge.
Yes, sir. Well, we feel very confident in our position.
Mm-hmm.
This was actually a matter that was litigated back in 1995.
Mm-hmm.
Attorney General Ben Chandler there was an allegation made against him that
Mm-hmm.
he did not meet the 8-year requirement for running for this office because 4 years of his 8-year practice had been working as the state auditor, and so someone had alleged that therefore was not essential in terms of his qualification. But the state circuit court and the courts here in Kentucky made the very critical point, which is that the responsible consideration here is how long have you been licensed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've been 8 years licensed, then that is the critical question. And of course, I will be 8 years licensed before the November 5th election. So we feel very confident in our position. The hearing will be on October 7th, and I look forward to winning against Mr. Stumbo then, and then beating him again in November 5th.
Mm-hmm. You're running against, obviously, your opponents, excuse me, Greg Stumbo, former Speaker of the House, a former state representative, and former Attorney General in Kentucky. He basically, aside from the lawsuit, he says he's not involved in that, of course, but he does claim that he has much more experience than do you. How do you respond to those arguments on his part?
Well, I think experience is good if it's the right kind of experience. But let's take a look at Mr. Stumbo's record. When he was Speaker of the House, he repeatedly blocked pro-life legislation. I think that's inconsistent with the values that we have here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. When he was in leadership in 2013, when he was Speaker of the House, he also offered legislation that would have given driver's licenses to illegal immigrants. And in my judgment, what's even worse than that is he would have told our federal law enforcement community that they cannot track those individuals, effectively making Kentucky a sanctuary state. I think that sends the wrong message to our law enforcement community. When you run to be the Attorney General here in Kentucky, you run to be the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the Commonwealth, working closely with our state and federal law enforcement community. I think when you've made a statement on the record like he did in 2013, essentially trying to give driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, he's essentially said to our federal law enforcement community that he doesn't care what their responsibility is in terms of enforcing our immigration laws here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Again, I think that sends the wrong message. I think in many ways you forfeit your right to be the Attorney General if you've made that sort of statement on the record. The other thing I'll make mention of is that he has been in some sort of leadership capacity over the last 30 years in the General Assembly or another elected office, yet he's done nothing for our teachers here. We know that's a big issue. Meanwhile, he fully funded his own pension. While his pension is fully funded, the teachers have the worst pension arguably in the country. And I think that sends the wrong message to our teachers and other public employees. When you were in a position of leadership, you chose to feather your own nest as opposed to helping those that are teaching and educating our young men and women. So I think there are plenty of things that he's done over his 30-year career that have been wrong for Kentucky. He was rejected by his own district in 2016. If you'll recall, he actually lost his bid for re-election when he was the Speaker of the House. And I think, in my judgment, on November 5th, all of Kentucky is going to reject him as well.
What do you consider to be the top 3 issues in this race?
Well, I think for me, as I've traveled across the Commonwealth, and I've been working really hard to make sure that people understand my message, but what I've heard is, in terms of, one, obviously the drug epidemic, we've obviously seen how opioids have had a outsized impact on the Commonwealth, but we're also, as I talk to law enforcement officials, seeing a resurgence of crystal meth here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So we have to have a multifaceted approach in the AG's office to deal with that. The other thing that I hear as I travail the Commonwealth here is that we also have Kentuckians that are just sick and tired of all these robocalls that we're getting on our phones. And so I want to make sure that we're working with the telecom companies, telco companies here in Kentucky to make sure that there are softwares in place to really dial down and dial back the number of robocalls that Kentucky families are receiving, because they become an annoyance, and they really have an impact on our elder population here as well. Sometimes these phone calls come in and they're very complicated, and there are savvy folks on the other side of the line, and so they're meant to trick our elder population. So we really need to get a handle on those. As Kentucky continues to become a larger and larger economic engine, and our output continues to grow here in Kentucky, we're also going to become a larger target for cyber crimes. So we need to increase the number of cyber crime investigators that we have in the Attorney General's office working on those issues as well. So I think, in my judgment, those are the top three things that we hear about. Obviously, we also hear a lot about the pharmaceutical companies and their role in peddling opioids into the Commonwealth. We're going to prosecute those individuals if they're bad actors and bad behaviors, bad actors and with bad behavior, without fear or favor. So those are some of the main issues and matters that I've heard as I've gone across Kentucky.
Are there other measures you would take as Attorney General, Daniel, on the drug problem, the general, both opioid and meth and so on, and any other drugs that are rampant?
Well, I think there's a few things that we can do in the Attorney General's office, and I've been thinking about these over the last few months. One of the first things I think that needs to happen is really just a shift in the mindset, right? Getting back to what I believe is the role of the Attorney General to be the Chief Law Enforcement Officer. The other thing that I've been talking about on the campaign trail is that right now there's a Department of Criminal Investigations in the Attorney General's office. There are about 5 investigators in that unit that are committed to and primarily focused on drug investigations. I think we need to increase the number of drug investigators that we have in that unit. 5 investigators for 120 counties is a pretty paltry number, so we need to increase that, making sure that there are more investigators to help with our state law enforcement community and our federal law enforcement community. The other thing that I announced a few weeks ago is that in the Attorney General's office we need to have an Attorney General's Ambassador program, and that would essentially mean that we'd have 2 volunteers in every county that will help really spread the message of how the drug epidemic has either directly or indirectly impacted them, but also to talk about the ill effects of drug usage and how that can really have negative consequences on the rest of your life. So we want to get those people into our Rotaries and to our other civically minded organizations like chambers and what have you, but also get them into our private and public schools to talk about the ill effects of drug usage. So those are a few of the ideas that I have about really expanding the reach of the Attorney General's office and fighting this epidemic, and making sure that the Attorney General, in my judgment, isn't just fixated on what's going on in Frankfort, but is out in all 120 counties and asking really the critical question, in my judgment, which is, how can this office be helpful? And so that's what we were going to endeavor to do.
Is there a need for any additional Attorney General offices around the Commonwealth?
Well, that's another thing that I've talked about. As you get outside of, in my judgment, what's the golden triangle, say, of Northern Kentucky or Lexington or Louisville, people often feel removed from their state government, in particular the AG's office. And so I've made a commitment of figuring out a way to have a visible presence of the Attorney General's office outside of that golden triangle. And so we're going to do everything within our power after November 5th to make sure that occurs.
How big is the office as far as employees and budget?
There is roughly 247 employees in the Attorney General's office, and it has currently about a budget of $40 million.
Is that sufficient, do you think?
Well,
to do the job?
I think that, every Attorney General, when they go into that office, has an opportunity to sort of look at the structure of the AG's office and determine needs. I've already talked a little bit about plussing up the size of the Department of Criminal Investigations as it relates to the number of drug investigators that we have.
Right.
So we'll look at all those things about how we can best utilize the Attorney General's office. There's a criminal branch, there is a civil branch, and there's an advocacy services branch, which General Brashear has now termed the family services branch. So we're going to look at all the ways that we can restructure that office to the extent that's necessary to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all men, women, and children of the 120 counties.
Do I remember in the primary your advocacy of Solicitor General, possibly?
Yes, sir.
Is that still on the table?
Well, the governor's office has made a commitment to that through that office and have established that role. I believe Chad Meredith is our Solicitor General currently. But we're going to look at ways that, I think most of that was born out of the fact that you had a Attorney General Andy Beshear who just refused to defend certain laws. He refused to defend pro-life measures. He found ways to fight the governor and the General Assembly, filing lawsuit after lawsuit against the governor and the General Assembly. So I think they just became tired of the tension that was created by General Beshear's interest in running for higher office.
Is that the primary purpose of a Solicitor General, to argue the
Yes, sir.
stance of the Commonwealth in this case?
That's precisely right. But we'll be ready and able to do that when I become Attorney General, and I look forward to being able to argue and articulate the positions of the Commonwealth after the November 5th election.
So that brings me to the next question, and you've basically covered this, I guess, in a sense, but I'd like to hear you
Yes, sir.
comment further the proper role of the Kentucky Attorney General as far as defending policies and initiatives of the executive branch, specifically the governor of Kentucky.
Well, I think our responsibility, first and foremost, is to the United States Constitution, the Kentucky Constitution.
Certainly.
And I think when you again raise your hand to be the Attorney General, you make an oath to defend the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. The General Assembly is the representative body for the people of Kentucky, and the people of Kentucky send their elected representatives to Frankfort to make the policy judgments. And I think it's the responsible thing to do for the Attorney General to defend those matters. We're going to get back to the bread and butter basics of doing that in the Attorney General's office. I look forward to being able to defend the Commonwealth and work on behalf of all Kentuckians on consumer-related matters. If there's something awry or amiss in terms of robocalls or are Kentuckians being defrauded on particular issues or particular matters, cyber crimes, human trafficking, all those things that touch the Kentuckians in terms of the public safety issues and challenges that we have here. I look forward to being able to carry that banner and that flag for Kentuckians in the Attorney General's office.
We hear periodically the Attorney General of a state joining with Attorney Generals in other states on certain issues. Explain that process and when is that appropriate from your perspective?
Well, I think it's appropriate whenever there is something that would negatively impact the constituency we have here in Kentucky. Generally, that occurs whenever there's some matter that goes up before the United States Supreme Court. If there's a multi-district type of litigation that involves, again, various jurisdictions, whether that be state jurisdictions or federal circuit jurisdictions, the attorneys general across the country will get together. The best example that I can give you or provide right now is on tech investigations into some of our largest tech firms. Right now, there is a bipartisan group of attorneys general across the country who are helping and run the investigations into determining whether there were any deceptive practices that were conducted by some of the larger tech firms in the country to really deceive people into giving over private information that was used to either track those individuals or gain advantage in terms of advertising to those individuals. So I'll be a part of any of those matters that there is a bipartisan group of attorneys general that are working on those types of issues, and I look forward to being able to, again, really hold the banner, if you will, or carry the flag for Kentuckians on those sorts of issues.
I certainly don't purport to understand the complexities of the lawsuits that attorney generals from different states have filed against Big Pharma on the opioid issue. One of the companies has declared bankruptcy, and there's a debate going on now here in Kentucky that maybe we settled for too small amount of money.
Yes, sir.
What's your comment on that? That would actually involve former Attorney General Conway as well as current Attorney General Beshear, I believe.
Yes, sir.
Is that a valid criticism, in your opinion?
Well, I think others certainly have sort of made that argument and judgment, and I think we need to revisit that negotiation and that settlement. As you noted, that settlement was for $24 million against Purdue Pharma. You look at that figure, and it's a pretty paltry sum in terms of what we just saw as a rendered verdict out of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, the individual who led the prosecution in Oklahoma is a Republican Attorney General, Mike Hunter, and the rendered jury verdict was over $570 million. Again, you contrast that with the $24 million that we've gotten here, when we know in many ways Kentucky has been the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. So I think we need to revisit that settlement. And look, I'll tell you this, if I'm the Attorney General, we're certainly going to get more than $24 million for the harm that's been done here in the Commonwealth by some of these pharmaceutical companies who willingly demonstrated bad behavior in terms of peddling the poison here in Kentucky.
Some would compare it to big tobacco companies purporting, the settlement that ultimately was done with tobacco products and so forth, and that maybe, excuse me, here in Kentucky we cashed out a little bit too soon and for too small an amount.
Yes, sir.
Will you be an Attorney General that would be a zealot in fighting corruption? In the perception, there is a perception that Kentucky has a history of political corruption.
Yes, sir.
Right or wrong.
Yes, sir.
That's the way we're seen across the nation, and we always seem to rank as the former president of Kentucky, University of Kentucky. We ranked well in Kentucky uglies, and that maybe is one of them, is the perception of corruption. Will that be a key issue for you?
Yes, sir. Rooting out corruption will certainly be something that, as the Attorney General, I'll commit to working on day in and day out. And look, you're no stranger to the news reports we've seen over the last few weeks as it relates to a pretty high-profile case that just wrapped up in Frankfurt that had to do with one of these longtime political families here in Kentucky. I think there are a lot of legacy names here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that people are just, quite frankly, tired of, whether it be the Bashirs or the Stumbos or the Lundergans. People just want new and fresh ideas and new energy here in the Commonwealth, and that's what, in the Cameron campaign, what we've committed to doing is providing new energy, new vitality into this next decade, especially as it relates to the Attorney General's office. We look forward to doing that, and we'll certainly go after corruption wherever it might lead us without fear or favor.
Are there other issues that we haven't discussed yet that are on your mind in this campaign and your plans as Attorney General?
Well, I think, I was recently endorsed by President Trump, and when I sat with him in the Oval Office, he really wanted to know three things. He wanted to know where I stood on the Second Amendment, and I told him we're going to stand up for the rights of all Kentuckians as it relates to our Second Amendment protections here in this country. He wanted to know where I stood on the sanctity of life. I told him that I'm going to stand up for the rights of the unborn and those that cannot speak for themselves. And he wanted to know where I stood on illegal immigration, and I told him that I'm going to work with him and his federal law enforcement officials here in Kentucky to make sure that we don't become a sanctuary state. And so when I answered in the affirmative in terms of those three questions, he said, "Daniel Cameron, I want to endorse your campaign for Attorney General." So I was honored by that endorsement. I think the message that I've been articulating to Kentuckians is really resonating as we've gone across all 120 counties. I look forward, after November 5th, being the next Attorney General. I think we're ready to turn the page on the corruption, as you've noted, on the, really in my judgment, the partisan way that the Attorney General's office has been run. When I talk to people, I tell them there's no Republican or Democratic designation by the public safety issues that we have here in Kentucky, and I think they want an Attorney General. All Kentuckians want an Attorney General that's really just going to look out for them.
What do you say to some people in the media and out in the public that say conservatives and Republicans are mean-spirited and negative and guilty of attacks? How do you respond to that?
Well, I've tried to conduct my campaign to really in a civil manner. I hope that people, when they engage with me, recognize that my values as a Christian, I hope, are articulated and come through in the conversations I have with people. Senator Tim Scott said, I was recently with him in an event, and he said, "Daniel, people just want to know where your heart is, and are you sincere in your commitments to them?" And I hope that people are seeing that I want to do this job for the right reasons. I want there to be continuity in the AG's office in handling the public safety challenges that we have here in Kentucky, and I hope that is being conveyed to people, and I hope that they understand that I have a heart to really help folks that have been plagued by opioid addiction or drug addiction generally, and what can we do in the Attorney General's office to really be helpful in improving the public safety outcomes here in Kentucky.
Do you find young people turned off by politics in general these days? Are you seeing more engagement maybe as a result of your campaign in part?
I think I'm seeing a lot of young people really engaged. I was just over in Lexington this past weekend to knock doors, and there were a groundswell of young folks that were there helping us knock doors. So I think they're energized by not me per se, but the values that I've been trying to articulate, which is that the AG's office in many ways should be depoliticized, that we need to get back to the bread and butter basics of defending the laws here, and really being the chief law enforcement office, the top cop, if you will, here in Kentucky. I think those things are resonating, and I think we're producing a positive energy for this campaign, and I look forward to being able to serve the men, women, and children here of all 120 counties after November 5th as the Attorney General.
Do you think that you can unite the Commonwealth, at least to the extent that an AG has that capacity and that role? I mean, obviously that's more of a governor's job, but the Attorney General, I think, has some say-so in terms of how he or she approaches the job. You're the number 2 person in Frankfort.
Yes, sir.
With all due respect to all the other office holders,
Yes,
the
sir.
AG is number 2.
I think I have a huge responsibility in helping unify the Commonwealth, and I think the office and role of Attorney General really necessitates the bipartisan efforts that we'll have to undertake. Again, there's no Republican or Democrat designation next to the public safety issues that we have here in the Commonwealth. So I look forward to working with whomever wants to be a benefit and a positive contributor to helping stem the tide of the drug epidemic that we have here, and really working on all the public safety issues and challenges that we have.
We're down to under a minute, so take a moment and talk to the voters.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me
Indeed.
again. And thank you all for tuning in to watch today. Look, I'm running for Attorney General because it's my judgment that this office needs to get back to the bread and butter basics of being the chief law enforcement officer and really working closely with all the men, women, and children of 120 counties in our law enforcement community to stem the tide of the drug epidemic that we have here in Kentucky. I hope I can earn your vote. I look forward to being the Attorney General here in the Commonwealth after November 5th, and thank you for the opportunity to chat with you today briefly.
Daniel, thank you very much.
Yes,
we
sir.
wish you Godspeed out on the campaign trail.
Thank you so much.
This is John Chowning with Republican nominee for Attorney General, urging the voters to study the issues, look at the candidates, vote on November 5th, make informed decisions. Thank you very much.